Okay.
For the sake of this interview, please state your full name and community in which you now reside.
My name is John Edward Lennox. I live in Eastham, Massachusetts.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a small town in New Jersey. It was 1 square mile, had 20,000 people living in it. It was close to New York City, about 7 miles from New York City. Actually, when I was in my bed, the light in the Empire State Building would come around and shine in my window. That's how close it was. My high school class was 140 kids. It's kind of a well-to-do town. Most of the in those days, it was only dads that generally worked, and a lot of them worked in New York City and made pretty good money. So we had a good high school, and I benefited from that considerably.
What was your childhood like?
Well, my parents moved around quite a bit until I was 5 years old. Then we moved to this town of Rutherford, and I spent the rest of my childhood all the way up through college in that town, living in the same home. The street I lived on was on a hill, one block long. We had lots of kids. Summertime was baseball in the spring and summer, and football on the street. That was kind of the way it was. You walked to school. High school was about 20 minutes away, and middle school was a little bit longer, about 45 minutes, and we would walk home for lunch and then have to hightail it back after lunch. It was just a small town atmosphere. Lots of parades, Memorial Day, 4th of July. It was a good town to grow up in.
How did you end up in the military?
That's a good question. Maybe there's a couple of parts to that. When I was in high school, your age, 9th grade, was when the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin into Earth orbit, the first astronaut, and that kind of set the stage for a lot of things going on at that time. That kind of shocked the country, shocked everyone in the country, actually. And from that point on, the guidance counselors would always try to get us to take science and mathematics. And then I guess the following May, I guess in that fall, the Soviets launched a satellite. In April of my freshman year, they launched a man in space, and then we followed in May. And then President Kennedy came on in May also and announced that we were going to go to the moon. And this all kind of filtered into me. And as I mentioned, the guidance counselors were pushing us into engineering and science at that point. So I wound up going to college and wanted to major in chemical engineering. And they had ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps, at the college. And I thought, looks like an easy A. So I signed up for ROTC. And, you could, in a sense, quit anytime you wanted. But I stayed through the first 2 years. Then you had to make a decision going into your junior year whether you wanted to go into the senior part of ROTC, and they paid us $27 a month, which was part of the incentive. So I stayed in ROTC, and I just went with it. I'm not sure that I made a real decision to go into the military, but that, of course, led me into the military, and I was commissioned as second lieutenant when I graduated from college. That's how I got into the military.
Why did you join the Air Force?
Well, it was Air Force ROTC. So that's why I wound up in the Air Force. And coincidentally, we had to go to summer camp between our junior and senior years in college. And I didn't know anything about Cape Cod, but they sent me to Otis Air Force Base here on Cape Cod. So that was my first introduction to Cape Cod. I can tell you why we wound up in Cape Cod after I retired, but I'll save that for a later time.
How was your life in the military different from civilian life?
That's a good question as well. I don't know that it was that different. I was with my background in chemical engineering, and the Air Force put me into electronics. I always had, most of the time I had a desk job, except for the time I was on the Apollo aircraft, and that was 4 years of flying duty. I would go home at night. I did the same thing parents do today. I coached my two sons in soccer and baseball. I did have to do some traveling, but people in business travel as well. And I always looked at it as a job. And I thought, well, after maybe 12 years in the military, I should make a decision. And I was enjoying my life in the military. My family enjoyed it as well. So I wound up staying.
Where did you serve?
I served in a lot of locations. Of course, typically the military sends you to a school. And the first school I went to was in Denver, Colorado, at an Air Force base, to become a maintenance officer for aircraft electronics. But after that, I went to Patrick Air Force Base in Florida to work on the Apollo program as a mission controller on an airborne platform. From there, it was interesting. I decided I wanted to go back to college. And I guess space was the first frontier, and the next frontier was going to be oceanographic. And I thought, I'm all in for oceanographic. So I applied through the Air Force Institute of Technology, I applied for oceanography. About the same time, I received a letter in the mail from an military organization called the Air Force Institute of Technology. And they wanted me to go to communication school to get a master's degree. So that caused a little confusion, but we got in touch and talked it out, and I wound up going to Rensselaer Polytechnic for a master's degree in operations research, which led me to a base in Massachusetts, Hanscom Air Force Base, home of the Electronic Systems Division, and I was there for 3 years. Then they sent me to Andrews Air Force Base to become a manager, so to speak, at the headquarters for Air Force Systems Command. Then I went to another military school that was a year, then to the Pentagon. I spent 5 years at the Pentagon, one of the other best assignments I had. And then my last assignment was back at Hanscom Air Force Base in Massachusetts, and that kind of brought us down here when I retired.
What was your favorite place to serve?
Oh, well, I guess Patrick Air Force Base, which is on the coast in Florida near the Space Center. That was kind of nice duty. I lived right on the beach and the ocean. Met my wife there. That was probably the nicest duty I had from a location standpoint. There are other considerations, but from a location, that was perfect.
What were your specific jobs in the military?
I was in, after working on the Apollo program, I was in something called acquisition management. And what that is the Air Force, as all military services, they have to procure equipment for their units. And I was because of my electronics background, I wound up procuring radar systems. One of them was on Cape Cod. It's called Pave Pause. The other large radar I was involved in was an over-the-horizon radar that was built in Maine that could detect aircraft as far away as 1,800 miles from the U.S. coastline, and that was used for defensive surveillance for the United States. So most of my career was in defense and surveillance.
What was your favorite and least aspect of those jobs?
What was my favorite?
And least favorite aspect.
Oh, okay. I guess the favorite part of those jobs was I was always learning something new. Every radar system that I was involved in, you had to learn that technology. So that was one aspect, and I guess along with that, when I was at the Pentagon, that was another great assignment. I was the research and development manager for strategic defense. So I had to understand everything about electronics, optics. So I had to have a broad technical knowledge. And I was the kind of person that I didn't know it all, but I wanted to know it all. And I would study it, and I enjoyed that aspect of it.
What was your happiest memory from the military?
The happiest, I guess the happiest time was when I was at Patrick Air Force Base and I met my wife. She was working for NASA. We met in a Methodist church. They had a single adult group that it was open to anybody of any denomination. It was just a place to meet. So I think that was probably the nicest time of my life. And then, of course, later on you start a family and you enjoy that as well.
What was your darkest memory, if you had one, from the military?
Oh, okay. That's a good one. When I went into the military, first of all, I wanted to, because of my chemical engineering background, I wanted to get into rocket propulsion, and I decided I wanted to go to the Space Center in Florida, and they had something we called the Dream Sheet. You could pick a location. I picked Florida. You could pick the geographic part of the country. I chose the southeastern part of the United States. And then I figured out what the third category was. But I picked all of these so that there was no way I was going to go to any other place except to that Kennedy Space Center area, and I'd work on rockets. When I got my orders, they sent me to school to become a maintenance officer for fighter aircraft. That was my darkest moment. I thought, how do I get out of the Air Force? I mean, this is not what I asked for. But in retrospect, the personnel people knew what they were doing, and they assigned me to Patrick Air Force Base in Florida, working in the space program. It's just that I was a mission controller on an airborne platform, and I had to learn electronics. When I got to that job, I was elated, and I enjoyed, talk about nice things. I enjoyed that job. Flew all over the world, saw all different kinds of things.
Could you elaborate more about your job on the Apollo?
Yes, I was a mission controller, and what that meant was every time there was a Apollo launch, there were two critical phases. They would put the astronauts in Earth orbit, and the second time around, they would fire the engine to go to the moon. That was called a translunar injection. that was a critical phase of the program. If things didn't go right, you don't know where the astronauts would have been. The only way they could get the information on what we called the burn to go to the moon was to have an airplane flying below them. We would typically fly at 36,000 feet, roughly 7 miles. And then the astronauts would be about 60 miles. We would collect all the information coming down from the Apollo spacecraft, and we would record it on our big recorders on the airplanes. The other important part of the moon program, well, there are a lot of important parts, but the other one from our standpoint was when they returned to Earth, they went through something called a blackout. Are you familiar with that at all? Where the spacecraft hits the Earth's atmosphere, and the friction with the air molecules, even though they're thin at that altitude, actually burns off part of the heat shield. And in the process of burning off the heat shield, it burns off all the antennas. And after this intense heat period is over, generally around 3 minutes, the astronauts put out new antennas, and they try to communicate. They would communicate to our airplane. We'd have our antenna pointed right at them. We'd receive all their voice. We would retransmit that to Houston, and then the astronauts in Houston would talk via our airplane. That was a critical phase. Now, on Apollo 8, my aircraft was a primary for that re-entry. The blackout period was supposed to have been 3 minutes of that intense heat. We had lots of clocks on our airplane, timing different things, one of which was the blackout. And, we watched as it ticked along. It got to 3 minutes. And I could hear Houston say, Apollo 8, this is Houston, do you hear me? And nothing but crackle. Seemed like an eternity. Another call from Houston, Apollo 8, this is Houston, do you hear me? Silence. And then at that point, we had to believe that maybe something happened. Like they could have burned up. They could have skipped off into space. We didn't know. Third time, Houston says, Apollo 8, this is Houston, do you read me? And that's when the astronauts replied and said, Houston, Apollo 8, we read you A-OK. So that expression A-OK came from, that was Apollo 8. I might have said Apollo 13, meant Apollo 8. Another tense situation was on Apollo 13. And I have a long story on that. I don't know if we have time to talk about that. How are we doing on time? Okay. Apollo 13, which was coincidentally my last mission before I was reassigned. We were sent to a base in northern Australia, which was like an old Wild West town in the United States, dirt roads, wooden sidewalks, but they had an airport. And we were going to stage out of that airport to be available for the translunar injection. Well, everything happened in the middle of the night. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, a bus picks us up, my crew. They had already picked up the pilots and brought them out to the airplane. They came back and got us. As we're approaching the airport, I could tell things weren't going right. Normally, you get used to the sounds of an airplane. There's a power cart, an air conditioning cart. There's the sounds of the engines. And even before we got there, I was hearing noises that made me think that something was wrong because the engines were running. The power cart was on. The air conditioning cart was on. And as we got closer, I could see a fire engine and a fuel truck parked very close to the engine, to the airplane. And when I got out of the crew bus with my crew, the pilot, Colonel Pangallo, said, we got a problem. We got a leak in one of our fuel tanks. So what he was doing was he had two engines, two of the four engines, the so-called outboard engines, running, burning off fuel. He had people pumping fuel out of one of the fuel tanks that had a leak in it, trying to get the fuel below the leak so we could take off, because we were critical. NASA might cancel that mission if they couldn't have that data. So it was scary, and you could smell the fuel in the air. And the Colonel Pangallo said to me, Jack, get your men on board and check out the electronics, which we normally did. So we did. It was the fastest checkout we ever did, because that plane was like ready to blow up. But this was Apollo, and we had to do it. So we did. We wound up getting the fuel below the crack. We took off. We went out, did the mission, collected all the data coming down from the Apollo 13, came back into the base in northern Australia, and on the way in, we sucked up a flock of birds in one of our engines. That engine was dead. But not to worry, because it would take 3.5 days for the astronauts to get to the moon. They would land on the moon, another couple days. They would come back. So we had plenty of time to get a new engine. And the Air Force would send out a cargo airplane with a new engine, and the people that would replace the engine right there at that airport. Well, as you probably, if you've seen the Apollo 13 movie, you know things didn't go right. An oxygen tank blew up, and they had to basically cancel the mission. But it was more than canceling the mission. They had to get the astronauts back safely. So my airplane, my crew, was going to do the re-entry. So we received a radio message the day after the explosion on the spacecraft, and they said, if they make it back, you are not in the right location. So we want you to fly to Guam Air Force Base, and we'll have an engine there waiting for you. So that meant we had to take off on 3 engines, which that wasn't a real big deal. After all we've been through, that was not a big deal. So the next day, we took off on 3 engines and flew to Guam. There was no engine there. They said, fly to Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. We definitely have an engine there for you. Well, that was a longer flight. We only had so much fuel because we had a crack in one of the fuel tanks. We only had 3 engines out of the 4. So that was going to be a little sporty. So instead of flying at 35,000 feet, we're flying at 39,000 feet, which is pretty, well, it's all high, relatively. But about halfway across the middle of the ocean, we lost pressurization on the airplane. And we had the oxygen mask came down. We were on oxygen. We had to get strapped in. The pilot could hear the pilot and the navigator talking about where are we going to land, where are we going to land, you know, and the crew, the maintenance people on the airplane, they were trying to find out what the problem was. People were scurrying around. I was just strapped into my seat with my helmet on, breathing oxygen, and so was my crew. My crew was about 7 people. We had to dive down to 11,000 feet so we could breathe. And then finally they found the problem. They fixed the problem, went back up to altitude, landed at Hickam Air Force Base, got a new engine. And again, it was, if they make it back, you're not in the right location. You have to go down to American Samoa in the South Pacific, which we did. And on the night of the reentry, we were the primary airplane. Again, this was my last mission before I was going to graduate school. As they were coming in, we went through our checkout, and we had to move the antenna to point it at the astronauts. The antenna wouldn't move. And we had a lot of things that we went through. You know, you check the electronics, that didn't work. And I told the pilot, shake the airplane. They had some way of shaking the airplane and, try to shake it loose. That didn't work. And we went through all that, and then finally I had to call back to my headquarters and say we had to abort the mission. I brought in a backup airplane because we always had a backup, except for that translunar injection on Apollo 13. So the other airplane came in and did the mission. I'll go through the rest of it real fast. We got back to our base in Patrick Air Force Base. The next day, the tail of the airplane was gone. And so I went up to the crew chief and I said, "What happened to the tail?" He said, "You had a crack in one of the structure pieces in the tail from before you left until now. We just got the part." And then I thought back to when I told the pilot to shake the airplane. He did shake the airplane, but then he came back and he was standing next to me and he suddenly screamed at me, "Tell them to stop." He was probably the only one that knew there was a problem with the tail. And that was my last mission before I went off to graduate school. But it all turned out well, and the astronauts came back safely. So that was the highlights, some of the highlights of I guess the only other thing I did, which was kind of interesting, was the Apollo 11 went to the moon and brought back a lot of rocks, lunar rocks. And when they came back, we were in Hawaii, they loaded all the rocks on our airplane. So we had all these lunar rocks as well as the astronauts' blood and urine and that kind of thing. And we flew that back to Houston. That was kind of exciting to see all the people assigned to the Manned Space Flight Center. All the scientists in particular, when they got a hold of those rocks, they were just smiling from ear to ear. So that was a great assignment. And that's kind of what kept me going in the Air Force. And then when I got to the Pentagon, that was a tremendous assignment as well. So that's kind of why I stayed. But the reason I left was I had 2 children, 2 boys in high school. And I received a phone call from personnel asking me if I wanted to move my family to Los Angeles. And that's when I decided to retire, because I wanted my kids to finish high school.
What was your proudest moment from the military?
Proudest moment. I didn't think about it until maybe even today. But when I was down at Patrick Air Force Base, after Apollo 8, I received a phone call from the base newspaper called the Missileer. And unknown to me, I had been selected as the Junior Officer of the Year for the Air Force Eastern Test Range. I guess I didn't understand the significance of that. So they were asking me if I would give them an interview. And I was getting ready to go to Alabama for another Air Force school, and I told them I didn't have time to talk. So we did it on the phone, and so I was chosen as the Junior Officer of the Year for Air Force Eastern Test Range. That was quite an honor. I didn't realize it, at the time, because I was just doing my job, but that was important.
What was it like coming home after the military?
Well, home was Chelmsford, Massachusetts, because that's where I was living at my last assignment. And as I mentioned, my 2 boys were in high school, and we were going to stay right there. That was our home. So nothing really changed, except I changed my uniform from an Air Force uniform to a suit and tie, and I went to work for the Raytheon Company. And that was exciting as well, doing similar kinds of things as in the Air Force.
What experience would you say affects you most today?
Well, certainly the Apollo program, had some very emotional times. It was something very exciting. There was highs and lows. 3 astronauts burned up. I guess that was 1968. I don't know if you probably don't remember that. They were preparing for a mission, and I think it was Friday night. They were in the capsule, going through the checkout, and a fire broke out inside the capsule, and they were all killed. That was kind of an emotional time. Every mission was emotional. I guess that would be it.
How did the military change your life?
That's a very good question. As I mentioned, I grew up in a small town. And so that was, you have that small town atmosphere. You know everybody. They know you. And you're kind of confined to a small town. So going in the military really broadened my outlook. I traveled all around the world. Got to work with people in a lot of different nations. Got to learn a lot of technology. I was always on the advanced edge of technology, and that continued even after I got out of the Air Force with the Raytheon company. Tremendously smart people there, and that kind of thing excited me, kept me going.
So
I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, that was good.
Okay, all right.
I have one last question. So what is one word that you would use to describe your military experience?
One word. Enjoyable. I enjoyed it all. It was always something new. Every mission, every new assignment, you had to learn something new. And I enjoyed learning. I enjoyed working with people. You meet some great people. Even in retirement down here, I meet people who were in the military, and they tell me their stories. And so it continues to go on. So I guess it broadens your outlook. You travel all around the earth. At least I had a chance to do that in my job. Not all military people get to do that. I was lucky, and I got to do it right off the bat. The first assignment, it could have been very different if I had a different assignment, but I've been in a lot of places. I've seen a lot of things. Right now there's fires going on in Australia. I was there, albeit back in 1968. I was in that area, and it was a beautiful country out there, and I got to see it. But now it's they're really struggling down there.
Right. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.